singer who Simon described as having a voice like liquid gold.
Which coincidentally is also what Simon uses to wash his face. Liquid gold. It's Alice Fredenham.
There's a particular kind of viral moment that only reality television can produce. A stranger walks onto a stage, opens their mouth, and for 3 minutes, an entire audience forgets to breathe. In the spring of 2013, that moment belonged to a 28-year-old beauty therapist from Hertfordshire named Alice Fredenham. Her Britain's Got Talent audition would go on to rack up tens of millions of views, earn one of Simon Cowell's most quoted compliments, and turn her into a household name almost overnight. And then, just as quickly, she was gone. No farewell tour, no tell-all interview, no dramatic falling out caught on camera, just silence. More than a decade later, that silence is still the most interesting thing about her story. So where did Alice Fredenham actually go? And why did a woman with one of the most talked-about voices in British television history choose to walk away from it? Part of what keeps this particular "Where Are They Now?" question alive is the contrast at its center. Reality talent shows tend to produce two kinds of afterstories: the runaway success who parleys a season into an actual career, and the contestant who fades because the talent simply wasn't there to sustain more than a few weeks of attention. Alice doesn't fit either bucket cleanly. Nobody who watched her audition walked away thinking she lacked ability. Quite the opposite. And yet her post-show trajectory looks a lot more like quiet withdrawal than industry-fueled stardom. That mismatch between obvious talent and a chosen exit is unusual enough that it keeps generating fresh curiosity. Years after most of her fellow Series 7 contestants have been largely forgotten by the general public. Alice Fredenham was born on the 14th of April, 1985, in Harpenden, a market town in Hertfordshire not far from St. Albans. There was nothing about her upbringing that pointed toward reality television stardom. She grew up around music, but not fame, took an early interest in singing, and by her own account left formal schooling behind before finishing her education in order to chase performing instead. In the years before her big break, she supported herself the way a lot of working musicians do, with a day job. Specifically, she trained and worked as a beauty therapist, taking on singing gigs at weddings, private parties, and small local functions whenever they came along. It was steady, unglamorous work, and by all accounts she was good at both halves of her double life, skilled with clients during the day and quietly building a reputation as a jazz-influenced vocalist by night. That combination, real talent paired with almost no industry profile, is part of what made her eventual breakout so startling to viewers. She wasn't a stage school graduate with a demo reel and a manager. She was, as far as the public could tell, just someone's beautician who happened to sing like she'd stepped out of a smoky 1940s supper club. It's worth dwelling on that detail for a moment, because it shaped how the public related to her once the audition went viral. Talent competitions are full of young singers who've spent years in stage schools, function bands, or amateur musical theater, visibly building toward a moment like this. Alice's background read differently. She'd chosen a genre, jazz and torch song balladry, that wasn't especially fashionable for a woman in her late 20s trying to break into a pop-dominated industry, and she'd kept performing on the side of ordinary working life rather than treating music as a full-time pursuit. That gave her an air of being discovered almost by accident, even though, by her own account, she'd been chasing this kind of opportunity deliberately for years. The gap between how effortless she looked on stage and how much uncertainty she carried into it privately is a thread that runs through her entire story. Before Britain's Got Talent ever entered the picture, Alice tried her luck on a different program, The Voice UK. She chose a jazz standard, The Lady is a Tramp, for her blind audition, hoping one of the coaches would spin their chair around. None of them did. It's easy to underestimate how much that kind of rejection can cost a performer, especially one who already struggled with nerves. Alice has spoken candidly in interviews about dealing with severe stage fright, not just the ordinary butterflies most performers describe, but something closer to genuine panic before she stepped in front of an audience. A public, televised rejection on top of that kind of anxiety would have been enough to send plenty of people back to their day jobs for good. Instead, she tried again. When she signed up for Britain's Got Talent, she made a decision that says a lot about how she was feeling at the time. She didn't tell anyone. Not her friends, not her family, not the people closest to her. In her own words, given later to a local reporter, she went into the audition essentially alone, reasoning that if it went badly, she wouldn't have to explain the failure to anyone she loved. It's a small human detail, but it captures something important about who Alice Fredenham was before the world knew her name. Someone protecting herself from disappointment by keeping her ambitions private. That kind of secrecy is more common among reality contestants than viewers might assume, but it's usually framed afterward as a fun bit of trivia, a cute anecdote about surprising the family with a golden buzzer moment. For Alice, it reads a little differently in hindsight. Rather than a playful surprise, it comes across as a coping strategy, a way of managing the very real fear of public failure by controlling exactly who got to witness it. Given everything that followed, the sudden fame, the abrupt exit, the long retreat from public life, that instinct to control her own exposure looks less like a one-off audition day quirk and more like a consistent thread running through the way she handled her entire, brief brush with celebrity. On audition day, Alice chose My Funny Valentine, the Rodgers and Hart standard most associated with Frank Sinatra's recording of it. She sang it low, unhurried, and full of restraint, the opposite of a typical talent show belter. Before she even opened her mouth, she told the judges how frightened she was and admitted she hadn't told a soul she was there. Then she sang, and the room changed. Amanda Holden later described the performance as one of the most striking, sultry pieces of singing she'd heard on the show up to that point. David Walliams told Alice that when she sang, she seemed almost otherworldly, comparing her to a goddess and promising her he couldn't wait to hear her again. And Simon Cowell, a man not exactly known for gushing, delivered the line that would follow Alice for the rest of her career, telling her she had a voice like liquid gold. Alice, overwhelmed, broke down in tears on stage, explaining through the emotion that she'd never expected that kind of reaction, and that singing had always simply been her dream. The clip spread almost immediately. Within days, it had racked up millions of views, and it would eventually climb into the tens of millions, becoming one of the most watched auditions in the show's history. For a woman who only weeks earlier had been too afraid to tell her own family she was auditioning, it was an almost dizzying reversal of fortune. To understand why Alice's audition became such an enduring clip rather than just another viral moment that faded within a news cycle, it helps to think about what she wasn't doing. Talent show auditions, almost by design, reward volume and spectacle, big notes, key changes, visible effort. Alice's performance ran almost entirely against that grain. She sang quietly, in a low register, with long pauses and restrained phrasing that left space rather than filling it. It was a style built on control rather than power. Closer to the jazz vocalist, she clearly drew inspiration from then to the arena pop belting that usually wins over a Saturday night television audience. That contrast between expectation and delivery is a large part of why the judges' reactions felt so genuine rather than performative. Amanda Holden's description of the performance as strikingly sultry, and David Walliams comparing Alice to something almost otherworldly, both point to the same thing. They'd been braced for one kind of moment and got something entirely different. Simon Cowell's Liquid Gold line worked for the same reason. It captured a texture, a smoothness, rather than praising raw vocal power, which is usually the easier and more common form of talent show compliment. In an environment built around big, broad gestures, Alice's understatement became the standout. Momentum in reality television is a fragile thing, and Alice's stumbled just as it was building toward its peak. Heading into the live semifinals, she had prepared a version of Over the Rainbow. According to what she later told a local newspaper, producers asked her to switch her song at a late stage, pushing her toward a version of Cry Me a River instead. That kind of last-minute change would rattle almost any performer, but for someone already managing significant performance anxiety, it was close to a worst-case scenario. She hadn't had the rehearsal time she needed, small mistakes crept into the performance, and the nerves that had briefly vanished during her audition came roaring back in front of a live audience and a national broadcast. She was eliminated that night. It's worth noting, though, that Alice herself didn't frame the experience purely as a defeat. In later comments, she said she was proud simply to have reached the semifinals, and that she viewed the whole run as a genuine springboard rather than a failure, a chance to be heard by more people than she could ever have reached singing at weddings and small venues. Still, for the millions of viewers who had fallen for her audition, the sudden exit was jarring. One week she was the emotional highlight of the series. The next, she was walking off stage early. And the obvious next question, what happens now, went unanswered for a long time. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here, one that applies well beyond Alice's individual case. Live semifinals are a notoriously difficult hurdle for contestants whose original audition worked precisely because it was low stakes and intimate. A blind audition or an early round performance happens in a controlled setting, often recorded well in advance of broadcast, with none of the pressure of a genuine live vote. The semifinal is a different animal entirely, a live broadcast, an unpredictable studio audience, and a public vote riding on a single unbroken performance. For a contestant already managing serious anxiety, and now facing a late change to unfamiliar material on top of all that, the odds of recreating the audition's magic were always going to be steep. Her stumble wasn't really a sign that the earlier praise had been overstated. It was closer to what tends to happen when you strip away the conditions that made the original moment work. Reality competitions are often just the opening act of a longer, messier story, and Alice's post-show period followed that pattern closely. Her audition's popularity caught the attention of the wider music industry, and Sony Music reportedly extended her a demo deal not long after her run on the show ended. It wasn't a guaranteed album contract, but it was a real opportunity, the kind of foothold plenty of talent show contestants never get close to. Alice went into the studio and recorded material under that arrangement, but the relationship never developed into a full commercial release. No public statement laid out exactly why the material didn't move forward, though the likeliest explanation, based on how these arrangements typically play out, comes down to fit. Alice's sound was rooted firmly in vintage jazz and soul phrasing, a style that doesn't always translate neatly into the commercial pop landscape a major label is usually chasing. Whatever the precise reason, the deal quietly dissolved, and Alice was left without a label just as the public's attention on her was beginning to fade, a familiar and often painful pattern for contestants whose talent show moment doesn't convert into industry momentum. This is a stage in the story that rarely gets much airtime in whatever happened to retrospectives, but it's arguably the most important turning point in the whole arc. A viral audition creates attention. It doesn't create a career. Attention has to be converted into something durable, an album, a touring schedule, an ongoing relationship with an audience, usually within a narrow window before public interest moves on to the next viral moment. For an artist whose entire style ran counter to mainstream commercial trends, and who was already uneasy with the pressures of visibility, that conversion process was always going to be difficult. Losing the Sony arrangement didn't erase her talent or her fan base, but it did remove the one clear, fast path toward the kind of career trajectory the show's more commercially successful alumni have followed. Rather than chasing another shot at a major deal, Alice pulled back from the spotlight almost entirely for a stretch. Her online presence went quiet, public appearances dried up, and for a period it looked very much like she had simply stepped away from performing altogether. When she did resurface, it wasn't with a splashy comeback single or a new television appearance. Instead, she took a smaller, more deliberate route back into music, one that put her back in control of the terms. In 2015, Alice launched a Kickstarter campaign to fund an independent album, something she could make entirely on her own terms, without a label dictating direction or commercial strategy. She set a funding target of £30,000, a realistic figure for a modest, small-scale jazz and soul record. Her supporters came through in a big way. The campaign didn't just meet its goal, it comfortably exceeded it, pulling in well over £40,000 by the time it closed. That result told its own story. Even without a label pushing her name, without a steady stream of new content, and without the machinery of a major music career behind her, there was still a committed core of listeners who wanted to hear more from her, and who were willing to put money behind that belief. It's also worth pointing out how unusual that level of sustained support was, given how much time had already passed since her original viral moment. Crowd-funded music campaigns generally do best when they're launched close on the heels of active public attention. A fresh single, a recent tour, an ongoing media presence. Alice's Kickstarter arrived roughly 2 years after her BGT run had ended, well outside the window where most artists could expect that kind of grassroots financial backing. That the campaign still comfortably beat its target suggests her original audition had left a deeper, more lasting impression on a specific slice of listeners than the show's ratings alone would have indicated. People who weren't simply reacting to a viral clip in the moment, but who had genuinely kept listening in the years afterward. The album that grew out of that campaign, Under the Covers, eventually arrived through the independent label Cherry Red Records. Released in 2017, several years after the Kickstarter had wrapped, a reminder of just how slowly independently funded projects can move without a major label's resources behind them. It leaned heavily into jazz, soul, and blues-inflected covers, staying close to the intimate, torch song style that had made her BGT audition so memorable in the first place, including a version of Bluebird, the Wings/Paul and Linda McCartney song. There was no attempt to chase a trendier, more radio-friendly sound. If anything, the record felt like a deliberate continuation of the identity she'd introduced to viewers years earlier, rather than a reinvention. Reception among the people who actually heard it was warm. Fans, music blogs, and listeners who'd backed the crowdfunding campaign generally praised the clarity of her voice and the understated emotional control in her delivery, qualities that had drawn people to her in the first place. But warm reception among an existing fanbase and genuine commercial reach are two very different things, and Under the Covers struggled on the second front. Without a major label's distribution network, radio relationships, or marketing budget behind it, the album had a hard time finding listeners beyond the people who were already following her. It's a common outcome for independently released records, but for Alice, it meant that even a well-received project didn't translate into the kind of visibility that might have relaunched her career. It's worth spending a little more time on what Under the Covers actually was, because the record itself says something about what Alice seemed to want out of her career at that point. Rather than trying to write and release original pop material that might have had a better shot at radio play or streaming algorithms, she built the album around interpretations of existing jazz, soul, and blues songs, including a rendition of Bluebird, originally recorded by Paul and Linda McCartney's band Wings. That's a telling choice. Cover albums built around standards are a well-worn lane for vocalists who want a foreground tone, phrasing, and interpretation over songwriting or chart ambition. It's the same lane plenty of respected jazz and soul singers have worked in for decades, prioritizing artistic identity over commercial reach.